Please be seated. So this is not your mama's Mary Magdalene. And by your mama, I mean those of us who came from a tradition in which Mary Magdalene was known as the very sinful woman. She was mistakenly identified by Pope Gregory in the 10th century as the woman who was weeping at the feet of Jesus after being considered sinful, and she wept as Jesus was eating at someone's home and then wiped his feet with her hair. That is inaccurate. It's textually inaccurate. Nobody thinks that now, but it has persisted in the memory, the cultural memory of people, partly because we see things about Catholics in movies and TV all the time, and we think that that is the understanding of who she was. She was so labeled that way that in the 20th century in Ireland, when young women, unwed women become pregnant, teenagers especially, they would be put in these homes for unwed mothers and forced to work in laundries, and they were called the Mary Magdalenes. Who was Mary Magdalene? We know very little about her, except she is the woman named and being present at the tomb in all of the Gospels. She is the first person to see the risen Jesus, the first that he identifies himself to, and the first to be told to proclaim the gospel. The first woman, the first person ordained to say, "Go and tell that Christ is risen." Now, that collect you read, that you heard about her being healed by Christ in mind and body, is due to the fact that Luke says that Christ cast 7 demons out of her. We don't even know what that means, but none of the other Gospels say that. So to me, Mary Magdalene is the woman who had the guts to stand at the cross when other people were hiding. She was the one who had the guts to challenge the angels, to challenge the gardener, just say, "Where is he? I will take care of him." That's Mary Magdalene. Now, the question is, why has the church in its wisdom given us a reading from the book of Judith? It's the only time you hear it in the lectionary is if you happen to celebrate the Feast of Mary Magdalene, which very few churches actually do. And people rarely read the book of Judith. So I'm going to summarize it for you, because what you got was a snippet of a prayer. But the reason that the book of Judith is so significant is that it is the most speech by any woman in a Bible. She has 3 long prayers. You've heard of Mary's Magnificat, the prayer of Hannah, the Song of Miriam, and so on. They get, 15 lines. She gets 3 long prayers, and she also gets a whole story about her, and she's the heroine. Now, interestingly, I'm going to show you what they teach us. This is a Standard Study Bible, NRSV, and this is what it says about the book of Judith. Although the book of Judith came to be considered historical, it was composed as a fictional novella, much like other Hebrew stories with a central female protagonist, such as Esther, Tobit, and Susanna. And I would add Ruth, which is referred to by my former Bible professor as a little gem of a fable. Now, story about a great heroine Judith is called a novelistic fable, but the story of David slaying Goliath with a little stone coming out of a slingshot, well, that's history. The story of the River Jordan being stopped so that Joshua could go in and with a small army defeat all the Canaanites, that didn't really happen in history. That's called history. Moses parting the Red Sea, well, God parting it through Moses, but nevertheless, that's history. But the story of Judith, that's a fable because the woman's the hero, and could a woman actually save Israel? Well, here's what happens. Now, there are aspects of the story, I'll just tell you, that are not quite historical, but that's true of every book of the Bible, actually. So, King Nebuchadnezzar had, with the Assyrians, taken over several lands, and he was mad at any tribe or people that was resisting him as not only their king, but also their God. He needed to be worshipped as their God, and as you know, Israelites aren't going to do that. So they lay waste to a number of nations, and they had already done it. And he had found out that the Israelites were resisting because they were not going to call Nebuchadnezzar God, right? They were being faithful to God and their covenant with God. Now, intelligent intelligently, the Israelites had replanted themselves when they came back from the Babylonian exile on the top of the hills, because the Ammonites, the Canaanites, others were in the valley. They didn't want to have battles with them, so they got the high ground. And Nebuchadnezzar found out that they were resisting General Holofernes, his great general, found out they were resisting, and he said, let's go wipe them out, with 120,000 soldiers and spear throwers as well, and so on. But as they approach, they discover that the Israelites have this one source of water, pools in a river at the bottom of the mountain. So somebody says, you know what? We don't need to fight them and lose any men. We can just stay here and control the water supply, and they're going to die of famine and thirst in 30 days. So Holofernes says, good idea. And it says they partied. They just partied. Meanwhile, the Israelites are panicking, and they're doing what the people of God do. They are fasting, they are praying in the temple, they are begging God to save them. And yet they start to fall from thirst. And so they clamor, they complain to the community leader, Uzziah, and he says, we'll keep praying for 5 days, and if God has not saved us in 5 days, then okay, we'll go surrender and let them enslave us. Hopefully they'll enslave us and not kill us. Well, Judith finds out. Now, Judith was the wealthy widow of a very successful husband, and she had inherited his land, all of his slaves, the livestock, and monetary wealth. And it says in the Bible, and she was in charge of the estate. She ran a huge estate. This was written by a first-century Palestinian Jew, by the way. Nothing, and nobody in the story finds that remarkable. She calls the leaders to her house and she says, I hear that you said this to them. She says, how dare you test God by saying God had better fix this problem in 5 days, or we have to allow ourselves to be taken over. She said, you need to keep praying to God, you need to trust that God's going to do it, and you need to thank God. Then she says this lengthy prayer, you just heard a snippet of it, and part of that prayer includes the words, and help me kill that general. It just doesn't, we don't put that in the church, but it actually says that. And then she says to them, I'm going to take care of this. I'm just not going to tell you how I'm going to do it, so don't ask me any questions, but we will be okay in 5 days because I trust God to help me. She takes her maid, and she gets dressed in her finest clothes. She wears her best and most expensive jewelry, her best makeup, her most expensive perfume. And then she goes and walks into the camp of the Assyrians, and they capture her and the maid. And she says, hi, boys. I'd like to speak to Holofernes. Now, she is listed several times as being incredibly beautiful and incredibly wise. Lucky woman. And they say, well, come right this way. In fact, we're going to get a team of 100 soldiers to escort you so you'll be safe. I'm not making this up, people. It's in the book of Judith. So she goes into the room of Holofernes, and he is brought to her with the lamp bearers and the silver lights. And he says, wow, hello, Judith. And it says that he was completely captivated by her beauty. And she says, these are the words, the deceitful words that Judith mentions in her earlier prayer. She says, I want to tell you that you don't need to come and attack yet. The Israelites are being disobedient to God, and as you all know, when Israelites are disobedient to God, God's going to give them over to the enemy. So God is going to give them to you. All you need to do is wait. I will advise you. I'll keep going there at night and praying with them, and I will let you know when God has given them over to you. And he goes, what a wise woman you are. We'll do that. Would you like to come to dinner tonight? And she says, well, actually, I eat kosher, so I can't eat what you eat, but I'll be eating with my maid. So she does this every night. She goes to the camp of the Israelites, and she prays with them, and then she comes back into his camp. Well, on the fourth night, it says that he is overcome with his passion and desire, and he says, tonight, I will seduce her. And he says, tell her she will eat with me tonight, and she will drink with me tonight. And she says, okay. She brings her kosher food. They drink a lot of wine. I imagine Judith kept the conversation going for a long time because Holofernes keeps drinking and drinking, which is not a good thing to do, kids, by the way, until he gets what the Bible says, dead drunk. It says that he is dead drunk. And what happens to a man when he is dead drunk? He is not as dangerous to a woman. He falls asleep, and she sees her moment. She takes the sword that is above his head, and she severs his head. She gives it to her maid. Her maid puts it in a bag. She says to the Assyrians, I'm going to go pray with the Israelites like I've been doing every night for 4 nights. And then she takes the head to them and she says, fear not, God has delivered us. God has saved us. They're all amazed. They're going, Judith, you're amazing. What a heroine you are. And she said, don't worry, in the morning they're going to realize that Holofernes is dead and the Assyrians are going to run and then you're going to turn around and chase them and it'll be a slaughter. And that is what happens. And then she does her final prayer to God in which she thanks God for empowering her, for helping her to do that, for giving her the wisdom to use deceit and feminine wiles, which were the weapons that she had in her disposal to defeat Holofernes and the Assyrians. That is the woman that is given as the model for Mary Magdalene. Pretty interesting, huh? And it's called a fable. But everything that David did and Moses did and so on, that's called history. It's as if we don't want to quite believe that a really faithful woman like Mary Magdalene or Judas could turn the world around, could save a nation, could do something incredibly special. But fortunately, we have the WNBA to prove to us that one woman or 2 women can dramatically change the course of how we perceive things and upend society. And I'm really sorry. I probably scared him with the story of Holofernes. I'm sorry. When I was a kid, I played in softball, I played field hockey, I played basketball. I don't remember any relatives ever coming to see me or my friends play girls' sports. Basketball, softball, soccer, field hockey. I was in high school field hockey. I never saw any relative of anybody coming to see a game played by a girl. Then all of a sudden, we see this revolution happening, and you saw it with the CF Buffs women, right, the women's basketball team, that all of a sudden people are taking note of, among other things, women's college basketball games. And you see these incredible stars, Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, these incredible people, and now they've joined the WNBA, and what's happening? Attendance is up 45%. And why does that matter? Because when attendance is up 45%, more people are buying tickets, ESPN and ABC are covering it, and women will finally get paid, maybe 8% of what men are making instead of 2% of what men are making. I'm talking about basketball players, professional basketball players. It's a revolution happening. When I worked in the LA area, I had a church member, and she always had season tickets to the Los Angeles Sparks. That's the women's team in Los Angeles. And she kept encouraging me to buy tickets and to go to these games. And I didn't. I didn't get it at the time, why one would do that as a way of transforming society. But then I realized the more people who pay attention to women's sports, the more we realize what amazing heroes we have out there on the court and how we are championing women for the number of assists they do instead of the number of dunks they do. Do you see the difference? It's an amazing transformation in our culture, and everybody's talking about it. It's on the front page of the New York Times. That's what 1 or 2 women can do who are just so good at shooting a basketball that people say, wow, women are inspiring athletes. Last night, our youth group watched Barbie. And Barbie was the blockbuster of the year, was it last summer, with Oppenheimer. And interestingly, there were debates about which was a better movie, Barbie or Oppenheimer. One is a, purportedly historical story of Americans racing with the Germans to see who could blow up the world first. We won. The Americans won. And the other is a story that uses a cultural icon, Barbie, to tell an allegorical story of what happens when we empower or disempower men and women in society. It starts with the Barbie world that you and I know, a fake world. I'm sorry, how many of you saw Barbie? I'm just curious. Yeah, because hardly anybody had seen it at 7:30, which is really interesting. So I won't summarize. I don't know why. I'm not saying anything about people, just it was very interesting. Barbie lives in the fake world where Barbie's the interesting person and Ken is just arm candy. And Ken doesn't like the fact that he's just arm candy. He feels unhuman, unloved. He wants something more. And she wants something more too, just not Ken. So she goes to real world and Ken sneaks in with her. And what happens when she enters real world? All of a sudden, Ken sees what's going on in the world, 10 seconds of seeing what's in the world, and he feels his oats. He's whole of fairness. He's powerful. He gets what he wants. He's in charge. And Barbie, also not having very much happen to her yet in the real world, starts to feel very sad and realizes that she feels disempowered, that she has no voice. She starts to cry like Mary Magdalene. She goes to the Mattel headquarters thinking, I'm Barbie, so I'll go talk to the people at Mattel headquarters. And they're freaked out that she's running around saying things that she shouldn't be saying, right? And so they attempt to literally put her back in a Barbie box, a Mattel Barbie box, with a plastic coating, so she can't speak anymore, and she can't do anything anymore. It's an important story because it talks about what happens when you try to take the voice or the power away from anybody in society. Now, it just so happens that, historically speaking, that is more likely to be women than men in society. That's why Judith is considered such a delightful story, because it's ironic, because it's turning the power dynamics on its head. But by calling it just a fable, we sort of take some of the power away from the story. Do you see how they're sapping the power away? Oh, Ruth isn't a real story. Well, how do we know Ruth isn't a real story? How do we know any of them are or are not real stories? There's also another type of danger in society when we take away people's voices or we don't believe them. The other part of the Mary Magdalene story that isn't in the John Gospel comes in the Luke Gospel, when Mary and the other women run to tell the disciples that they have seen the risen Lord, and the men said it was an idle tale. They didn't believe them. When we don't believe people who are speaking the truth, we do it at our own risk. To give you an example, one of the things they discovered is that many incidents of domestic violence that end up in murder are because a woman called 911 and said, he's threatened to kill me, or he's here, or he's got a gun, or he's got a knife, or whatever, and nobody comes because they don't think there's a real threat. There's a story in the New York Times right now about Spain, because Spain has this algorithm. They interview a woman after there's been a domestic violence episode about, has he threatened to kill you? Have you threatened divorce? They have all these factors that they think will predict whether that woman needs more protection. And it turns out the algorithm isn't doing a good job of predicting whether that woman is in further danger. So not listening to people's voices comes to harm all of us, really, men and women. Now, I realize that you've actually been listening to women preach to you for almost 13 years now, between Susan Springer and the others who have been here. And so it's not new to you that what a woman says might be interesting to hear. But we're kind of ahead of the curve still on that one, to be honest with you. And so I thank you for listening.